In the blistering deserts of ancient Mesopotamia, one of Rome's wealthiest and most powerful men met a death so grotesque that it echoed across the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, famed as the richest man in Rome, had amassed his fortune through the suffering of countless others. Yet in the end, he discovered that greed, when pursued beyond all measure, becomes its own executioner. This is the tale of how gold, the very element that raised him to the heights of influence, became the tool of his most horrific end. The year was 53 BCE, a time when Rome's appetite for conquest had reached a feverish pitch. Three men effectively ruled the known world in a fragile alliance: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his two partners carved their reputations on the battlefield, Crassus faced a bitter truth. Among warriors, he was regarded as little more than a banker. His fortune, amassed through real estate schemes and slave exploitation, bought him political clout but not the respect he craved above all else. He had watched Caesar conquer Gaul and Pompey bring the Mediterranean to heel, their triumphs immortalized in marble and memory, while his own name carried the sting of derision. Whispers called him the third wheel of the triumvirate, and the insult gnawed at him without rest. At 60 years old, when most men would have been content to revel in unimaginable riches, Crassus saw only one route to eternal glory: a military conquest that would eclipse the fame of his allies. To the east stretched the Parthian Empire, glittering like a mirage of wealth and opportunity. From the Euphrates to the Indus, this kingdom controlled the lucrative trade routes of silk and spice that connected the Orient to the West. Crassus convinced himself that conquering Parthia would grant him not only unmatched glory, but riches so vast they would dwarf even his staggering fortune. The Senate, suspicious of his motives, denied him the traditional declaration of war, yet Crassus pressed on regardless. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor, and at once began plotting his invasion. Local commanders, familiar with Parthian tactics, urged caution, but Crassus dismissed them as cowards. To him, the eastern desert kingdoms were no different from any other foe Rome had crushed beneath its disciplined legions and ingenious engineering. Why should Parthia prove otherwise? His confidence swelled further when reports suggested strife within the Parthian court, hinting at weakness ripe for exploitation. Crassus assembled a massive force: 7 legions, nearly 40,000 heavy infantry, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light troops. It was one of the largest armies Rome had ever gathered for an eastern venture. Among his officers was his beloved son Publius, a proven warrior who had earned distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The presence of his heir gave Crassus personal motivation beyond ambition. He dreamed of founding a dynasty of glory through conquest. The campaign began in the spring of 53 BCE, with Roman forces crossing the Euphrates at Zeugma. Early victories seemed to vindicate Crassus's confidence. Local towns surrendered without struggle or fell quickly before Roman siege engines. The flat terrain appeared perfect for heavy infantry maneuvers, and intelligence suggested King Orodes II of Parthia was distracted by internal unrest, leaving the frontier exposed. Yet what seemed like triumph was carefully laid bait. Parthian general Sharina, a brilliant young commander, lured the Romans deeper into the desert, away from their supplies, and into ground where cavalry reigned supreme. Skirmishes were mere feints, staged retreats meant to fuel Roman arrogance while exhaustion gnawed at them under the pitiless Sunday. As the legions trudged deeper, the truth of their enemy emerged. The Parthians were no disorganized rabble but a formidable power with centuries of experience in the harsh landscape. Their army was built on speed and reach: heavily armored cavalry cataphracts for devastating charges, and swarms of horse archers who could unleash arrows from astonishing distances, always beyond Roman retaliation. Sharina's methods exploited every flaw in Roman doctrine. Where Roman strategy relied on rigid formations and engineering, Parthian tactics thrived on mobility and adaptation. Where Rome expected a decisive, face-to-face clash, Parthia excelled at attrition and harassment. Scouts teased the Romans with fleeting appearances, only to vanish into the horizon. Supply convoys were ambushed by unseen riders, who melted back into the desert. Nights brought unease, with phantom movements and eerie sounds fraying nerves, leaving men sleepless and paranoid. Gradually, Crassus began to grasp the terrible mismatch. His heavy infantry, invincible in forests and coastal plains, faltered in the blazing emptiness. His cavalry was too few to challenge Parthian mobility, and his supply lines were shredded by invisible raiders. Every step forward carried the legions deeper into a trap from which there would be no return. The breaking point arrived at Carrhae, a small settlement in northern Mesopotamia, where Crassus decided to anchor his campaign. The surrounding landscape seemed to offer a defensive advantage, rolling hills for infantry positions, and a water source to sustain his weary troops. Reports suggested that Surina's main force was drawing near. Crassus, eager to seize the decisive battle that would redeem his invasion, prepared his army with renewed determination. At dawn, on June 9, 53 BCE, the Romans stood in their classic formation, legions massed in the center, cavalry wings on either flank, and light troops forming a screen ahead. Crassus remained with the heavy infantry, while his son Publius commanded the right wing of cavalry. Under the morning sun, the army gleamed like polished bronze, their standards rising proudly above what was thought to be the finest fighting force of the ancient world. But as Surina's troops came into view, the brilliance of Parthian strategy became undeniable. The Romans did not face a mirror image of their own formation, but an army composed entirely of cavalry. The Parthian heavy horsemen, clad in overlapping scales of metal that glistened like fish in the desert light, formed the unyielding core. Around them flowed waves of mounted archers, maneuvering with fluid precision. To the Roman generals, the spectacle was baffling, a force that moved like water, impossible to pin down or predict. The battle opened with an arrow storm of unprecedented scale. Thousands of Parthian archers loosed their missiles in unison, blotting out the sky. Roman shields, built to deflect spears and swords, proved ill-suited against a continuous hail of arrows. Hours dragged on, and the onslaught did not abate. Unlike previous foes, the Parthians had organized caravans of camels, loaded with endless supplies of arrows, ensuring their assault never slackened. Roman discipline wavered under this relentless barrage. Soldiers dropped in growing numbers, their armor pierced, their morale corroding. Desperate to end the torment, young Publius, eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, led a cavalry charge directly at the Parthian center. His men thundered forward, but this was exactly the trap Surina had engineered. The Parthian cataphracts absorbed the shock of the charge, their armor nearly impervious to Roman lances. Then, horse archers swept around the flanks, enclosing Publius's contingent in a deadly ring. Cut off from the main army, the Roman cavalry was surrounded, harried from all directions, and destroyed piece by piece. In full view of his father, Publius and his men were annihilated. Surina's soldiers mounted the severed head of Crassus's son on a spear and carried it before the Roman lines. The sight broke the old general's spirit. The commander, who had boasted of conquest across continents, now stood frozen, watching his heir's mutilated remains paraded in mockery. With Publius dead, the morale of the Roman army collapsed. The legions realized they were trapped, parched, exhausted, and hemmed in by enemies they could neither reach nor outmaneuver. Supplies dwindled, wounded men piled high, and every attempt to break free only ended in greater losses. The desert, once imagined as a highway to riches, had become a suffocating prison with no escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to withdraw toward Carrhae, hoping the cover of darkness and the protection of the city walls would give his army a chance. But the retreat devolved into chaos. Discipline vanished, as men abandoned armor and standards in a frantic bid to survive. Many fell to Parthian attacks in the night. Others collapsed from heat and exhaustion, left behind by comrades too desperate to stop. By dawn, what staggered into Carrhae was a broken remnant, half the army gone, the survivors demoralized and leaderless. The invincible legions of Rome had been reduced to a battered mob, and Crassus himself was hollowed by grief and failure. Within the shattered walls of Carrhae, Crassus faced the grim reality of his defeat. Nearly half of his mighty army lay dead, his son slain before his eyes, and the survivors too broken to mount another defense. Yet even in this state, a glimmer of hope seemed to appear. Surina, confident in his victory, extended an offer of negotiation. Under flags of truce, he proposed a meeting between commanders to discuss terms for Roman withdrawal. To many, it looked like a chance to salvage at least some dignity and rescue the survivors from total annihilation. Crassus's officers, however, smelled treachery. They warned their general that the Parthians could not be trusted, that this gesture of diplomacy was nothing more than bait. But Crassus, weighed down by grief and desperate to find any resolution, allowed himself to believe in the possibility of an honorable settlement. He He could not accept that his entire gamble had ended in catastrophe without at least trying to negotiate an escape. The meeting was set on neutral ground, with both leaders accompanied by small retinues. What followed remains contested by ancient historians. Some accounts claim the Parthians had intended all along to seize him. Others suggest a quarrel erupted during the parley, spiraling into violence. Whatever the cause, the outcome was certain. Crassus, once the richest man in Rome, found himself a prisoner of the very commander who had destroyed his army and slain his son. For Serena and the Parthians, Crassus was no ordinary captive. He embodied the arrogance and greed of Rome itself. His invasion had not been a defensive war or a response to provocation. It had been an unprovoked act of ambition, launched purely to enrich himself and claim military glory. To the Parthians, this made his punishment not just a matter of justice, but an opportunity to send a message. Crassus would not die swiftly. His end would reflect the true nature of his crimes. The decision was made to execute him in a way that symbolized both his character and his downfall. Gold, the very treasure he had worshipped, the lure that had led him into the desert, would be the instrument of his death. Parthian craftsmen heated the precious metal until it became a molten liquid, glowing with destructive beauty. In this transformation, gold revealed its dual nature, alluring yet lethal, precious yet deadly. Before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Romans, Crassus was forced to his knees. Soldiers pried open his mouth, silencing any final plea. Slowly, deliberately, the molten gold was poured down his throat. The agony was unimaginable. At temperatures hot enough to melt flesh and bone, the liquid fire seared its way through mouth, throat, and chest, while the condemned man remained horrifyingly conscious. This was more than execution, it was spectacle, a symbolic punishment carried out with theatrical cruelty. The man who had built his life on wealth, who had pursued gold above honor and human life, now perished by the very substance he had adored. His final moments became a grotesque parody of his own ambition. The mouth that once boasted of conquest was filled with the metal he had pursued. The voice that proclaimed Roman destiny burned silent by greed's flame. The execution of Crassus reverberated far beyond the desert where it occurred. News of his gruesome death spread quickly across the ancient world, shaking Rome to its core. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of conquests, had been shattered in the Mesopotamian sands. For the first time in memory, an enemy had not only defeated Rome in open battle, but humiliated one of its most powerful men in a way that could not be ignored. In the capital, panic and outrage gripped the Senate. The triumvirate that had balanced Rome's politics disintegrated. With Crassus gone, his vast wealth no longer countered the ambitions of Pompey and Caesar. The fragile alliance that had held together began to unravel, setting in motion the rivalry that would soon erupt into civil war and, ultimately, the end of the Republic. Ironically, in chasing glory through Eastern conquest, Crassus had accelerated the very collapse he hoped to prevent. The Parthians, for their part, understood the symbolic weight of their act. By killing Crassus with molten gold, they had not merely executed a general, they had delivered a message. Rome's greed and arrogance would meet with ruin if it overreached into Parthian lands. Other Roman prisoners were treated differently, resettled into remote regions of the empire, and allowed to live. A contrast meant to highlight Parthian mercy toward common soldiers, while emphasizing Crassus's singular guilt. His death stood as a warning. Greed would not be rewarded with victory, but punished with destruction. Stories of his end rippled through culture and philosophy. Writers and moralists seized upon the image of molten gold poured into his throat as a metaphor for the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting influence of wealth. Plutarch, writing generations later, used Crassus's fate as a lesson in hubris, reminding readers that fortune built on exploitation and greed cannot shield one from ruin. Whether the tale was literal truth or embellished for dramatic effect mattered little, the symbolism was powerful enough to endure. Archaeological traces of the disaster at Carrhae continue to confirm the scale of the defeat. Scattered weapons, shattered armor, and mass graves telling of legions annihilated by tactics they could not counter. Rome would never again underestimate the Parthians. For decades afterward, emperors approached the eastern frontier with greater caution, pairing diplomacy with force, too aware now that their adversaries were not barbarians, but a sophisticated power capable of both military and psychological warfare. Crassus's legacy, then, is one of warning. His transformation from successful financier to failed conqueror reveals how personal flaws, greed, pride, and reckless ambition can shape the fate of nations. The gold that ended his life remains a timeless symbol. The very thing most desired can become the weapon of one's destruction. His story reminds us that true leadership demands not only wealth and ambition, but wisdom, restraint, and empathy for the costs of power. Even now, the image endures. The richest man in Rome silenced by molten gold, his final moments a grotesque reflection of his life's obsession. Across centuries, his fate whispers a warning about the price of unchecked greed and the danger of never knowing when enough is enough.